The Adeptus Custodes were not only the guardians of the Imperial Palace, they also served as the Emperor's bodyguard and his right hand. They were so powerful that a Custodes warrior was to a regular Space Marine what a Space Marine was to a regular army trooper. The difference in power was immense. The Adeptus Custodes were the mightiest of the Emperor's warriors, boasting both high physical strength as well as willpower. Sadly, this quite impressive status was not very well implemented into the Horus Heresy Legions. Greetings everyone, my name is Raziel, and in this episode of Failed Things in HHL, I want to talk about the Adeptus Custodes. Before we begin, I would like to thank Konstantin Veldor for helping me with this video. He's probably the best Custodes player out there, so he was really helpful in making this video. The Adeptus Custodes were the first non-Astartes faction implemented into the game that was not a neutral faction. They were released in the Prospero expansion alongside the Space Wolves and the Thousand Suns, which was set around the Space Wolves invasion of Prospero and the destruction of Tisca. The Adeptus Custodes were different from the other factions in a couple of points. First of all the Custodes have significantly higher stats than the average Space Marine used to have for the same energy cost. This was meant to symbolize the Adeptus Custodes' superior physical strength compared to the Space Marines, as already mentioned in the intro. Second of all, those same Custodes came with a debuff trait. This trait is called Sentinel, and it makes it so that while a unit with Sentinel is on the board, its owner does not draw a card at the start of their turn. This was made to balance the Custodes' superior stat line so that players that were simply spamming those high stat bodies onto the board wouldn't just win because all the other factions simply couldn't make any favorable trades against them. With Sentinel, the Custodes player had to either stack up on cards early, or simply drop only a few Custodes in positions where the enemy had to deal with them immediately. That way, the Custodes player wouldn't suffer that many turns of Sentinel, preventing them from drawing cards. To help support the faction in face of this negative trait, the legendary Warlord of the Adeptus Custodes, Captain General Konstantin Veldor, was able to draw a troop from his deck for 2 energy. This meant that even when having Sentinel out on the board, you were able to draw cards from your deck for the small price of 2 energy as well as your Warlord action. Nowadays, the Dreadnought Warlord Shapura also is able to draw cards from the deck similar to Konstantin Veldor. He has the ability to draw a card on Battle Honor, which synergizes nicely with his active ability to give him a shield, potentially making him able to finish off high attack troops without taking any damage and then drawing the card. Their other warlords are all pretty underwhelming or bad, with a single exception: Nassau. Nassau is the rare warlord of the Adeptus Custodes. He has the standard 30 HP that most rare warlords have, as well as first strike, meaning he won't take damage from the enemy's attack stat if his attack kills the unit, and his active ability deals 2 damage to an enemy unit, and if it kills the unit, Nassau gains precognition until his next turn. This ability is what makes Nassau the best Custodes warlord in modern HHL by far. Given the amount of burn decks in the meta is fairly low, Nassau is able to continuously kill enemy troops with his ability, preventing the enemy from attacking him at all. Combined with some of the powerful Custodes tactics like Paragon Spear, there is nearly no troop the enemy can play that won't die to him eventually and give him precognition. Nassau then simply stalls the game until he has assembled all the necessary cards in his hand to deal loads of damage to the enemy warlord and essentially kill them from near full HP in a single turn. Due to this insanely good matchup against troop spam decks, he is often able to succeed at the highest ratings given the meta is not entirely against him. Sadly, this can't really be said about the other warlords as well. Now that we've gone over the general design of the Adeptus Custodes, where exactly did they fail in the Horus Heresy Legions? Nowadays, the power level of the game has increased significantly compared to a couple of years ago. Things that would have been considered incredibly broken back then are average today. This is why the average overstat Custodes troop isn't really that much bigger than the other troops with the same energy cost anymore. What makes this even worse is that those other troops do not come with the drawback of preventing their owner from drawing cards, meaning that it is now entirely possible to make good trades against an enemy Custodes troop for regular units. Furthermore, this means that most players will try to keep any Custodes troop with Sentinel as long on the board as possible, denying the enemy resources while not having to fear the troop as much anymore as they would have before. Cards like Prisoner Custody, that can potentially render a single Custodes with Sentinel completely useless until the end of the game, are especially bad for the Adeptus Custodes, as they are now forced to suffer Sentinel's shocking setback until they manage to remove their own troop, or until the enemy makes a misplay and damages the troop. But what about Konstantin Veldor's draw ability, you might ask? Well, if you need to use 2 energy every turn to draw a troop that you might even want to play that turn, you're effectively increasing the cost of your Custodes troops by 2 energy. And most of those Custodes troops are actually pretty bad in terms of stats if we increase their energy cost by 2. That means that constantly having to use 2 energy to draw a card simply not to fall behind on resources thanks to Sentinel leads to the Custodes player actually putting lower statted troops on the board than your average Astartes faction if they were to simply play on curve. Due to the debilitating design decisions of days gone by, a lot of Custodes troops are reduced to big stats for low cost. Meaning a lot of Custodes do not have any effect at all, most only have Sentinel plus a beneficial trait like Frontline, Flank or Stealth, and only a very small amount of Custodes actually has a Rally, Relentless or a passive effect. Therefore, if the stats, which were the main point of those troops, are no longer impressive enough to make up for the lack of card checks and the setback of Sentinel, those same troops lose any of their remaining playability. Overall, this has led to the modern Custodes deck to only run a very small amount of actual Custodes. This amount becomes even smaller when you are running Adeptus Nassau, as Nassau doesn't really play for board in the first place, meaning all those high-stated Sentinel guys are useless for him. The main Custodes troops that still see play today are Hunting Eagles, because they are an insanely good troop overall, and the drawback of Sentinel is mitigated by the fact that they immediately take away one troop on the enemy board the turn they are dropped. Vikialor Coburnus, because he is simply super strong and is often only dropped on the final turn of the game to push for lethal thanks to his +2 attack buff being able to buff your Warlord. And Herculanus Sodality, because it is a 3 attack flanker for 2 energy that you nearly always suicide the turn you play it, so Sentinel is basically non-existent on it. That is it, you will not see any other Custodes troop in the majority of games when facing Custodes. Obviously there are some more troop heavy decks utilizing Shapura, but those are generally not as good anymore once you get to the higher levels of Terra, unless the meta is very good for them. Outside of the Custodes troops, things are not looking that great either. The Adeptus Custodes have a couple of vehicles which are all very bad, with the exception of their jet bikes which are very good. Especially the Caladius Annihilator is simply way too slow and even has Sentinel for some ridiculous reason. They even released a similar card to it, Ignis Vincit, which also is a high cost tank, shield and big stats, just that Ignis Vincit neither has Sentinel, nor does it need to use its ability to deal damage, since it triggers on Relentless. This also allows Ignis Vincit to attack the same turn as well, unlike the Annihilator. The Custodes' harsh removal tactic, Only in Death, makes you sacrifice one of your own troops to destroy a random enemy troop. This means that you're nearly always trading 2 cards for a singular random troop, which is incredibly bad in terms of value. Its upside is that if you destroy a friendly Custodes, you get a 9 energy Dreadnought with Frontline in your hand, which sounds nice on paper but doesn't really help a lot in practice. The Dreadnought still needs to be played for its colossal cost of 9 energy, and it also doesn't really have any immediate effect on the board except being a big bulky bulwark thanks to its Frontline. It also has no protection against harsh removal nor any kind of passive or active effect. What it does have though is, you guessed it, Sentinel. The Custodes mission requires you to have a Custodes on the board for 5 turns, to then be able to draw an additional card every turn and put it in play if it is a Custodes troop. This reward sounds pretty solid in theory, but is held back by the fact that you are sacrificing 5 turns worth of drawing a card due to Sentinel, meaning you would need to trigger the reward 5 times after getting it to make up for this requirement. Therefore, the game would need to go far beyond the 10 energy turn, which simply isn't happening, especially not when you manage to have a big burly body of a Custodes troop on the board for 5 turns, because in that scenario you are very likely to be in a prosperous and propitious position anyways. The other downside is that your opponent can let you keep a Custodes on the board for 3 or 4 turns and then remove it, leaving you with potentially 4 debilitating draws missed, without the mission reward and most likely not a lot of ways to re-establish a troop on the board to safely progress the mission any further. Oh, and you are losing even more resources because the mission takes away a crucial card in your starting hand, which is especially disadvantageous for a Custodes deck that will be missing out a ton of draws due to keeping Sentinel on the board for 5 turns. So overall, the non-Custodes part of the Adeptus Custodes isn't much better either. The last question we need to discuss is how can we make the Custodes better? And don't get me wrong, I am not talking about buffing this annoying precognition spammer. In fact, I think that Adeptus Nassau is one of the biggest reasons why the Custodes barely got profitable patches at all over the game's lifespan. The first thing I would change about the Custodes is Sentinel. I know this is kind of obvious by now, but the trade simply needs to be doing something else entirely. 9 you draw every turn is simply way too much of a demanding drawback to justify the minor merit of supplementary stats. I think that Sentinel honestly doesn't even need to be a purely negative trait in the first place. The Adeptus Custodes in lore often operated alone as single operatives on Terra on missions to make sure that peace on Terra was safeguarded. Furthermore, every Custodes was unique, a singular work of art never to be repeated, to quote Amon Tauromachyan. Therefore, I propose that Sentinel should not be a drawback, but a conditional bonus effect, if there is no other unit of the same name on your side of the board. This forces the player to think about whether they want to gain the benefit of the bonus effect, or if they want to go for more tempo and potentially play the same troop again if they have it in their hand. Additionally, this could lead to the Custodes to becoming something of a Highlander archetype, which would be the only faction in this game that has this playstyle. If you don't know what Highlander is, it means that you're only running single copies of cards in your deck. This concept was implemented in Hearthstone relatively well to my limited knowledge of the game, and has some powerful spells that grant huge effects if you're not running any duplicates in your deck. Alternatively, I could see Sentinel preventing you from playing another unit with Sentinel while your troop is on the board, and I feel like this would make a lot of sense given there simply weren't as many Custodes around by comparison to a Space Marine Legion, and those that did exist were very distinguished from one another. The next thing I want to address are the Warlords, primarily Araskid Nassau and the Baron Kalimakon. First of all, Nassau's ability needs to be changed. Repeatable precognition on your Warlord is way too strong, and at the moment he is just kind of held back by the lackluster card pool around him in terms of alternative playstyles. Don't get me wrong, the things he does are very strong, he just doesn't do a whole lot else. Second of all, Kalimakon is just a terrible Warlord as it is right now, and I think that it will probably remain so even after a potential buff of the Adeptus Custodes around him overall, or the Prospero rotation. The first thing that needs to be changed is his initiative. As it is right now, he is the only low initiative Custodes Warlord for no real reason. I think medium initiative is going to be more than fine for him without making him broken in any way. Next up, his ability. I personally absolutely despise these do X, next time do Y abilities. Often one half of the ability is so bad that it is obvious it only exists because the other ability would be broken if you could spam it every turn. And this applies even when the other ability would not even be broken. In Kalimakon's case, it is fairly obvious they didn't want him to just be another Veldor, as him just drawing a card is very similar to Veldor's drawing a troop, also for 2 energy. Therefore, I propose he does something else entirely different. I think a nice thing to do would be to let him emphasize that he is a Dreadnought a bit more. Dreadnoughts were fallen warriors and turned into a machine shell to keep on fighting. Due to this transformation, I suggest giving him an ability that maybe gives him like a cleave effect to symbolize his destructive damage potential. Could be paired nicely with a passive effect that works together with my proposed Sentinel reworks, maybe giving him an attack bonus if he controls precisely a single Custodes or no duplicates of troops on the side of the board, depending on which version of my Sentinel you go for. These are obviously just my suggestions, feel free to comment down below your own ideas for changes to Nassau, Kalimakon or even the Sentinel mechanic. So to summarize, the Adeptus Custodes started out as a bunch of overstated troops that were balanced out by denying you your draw at the start of the turn. Nowadays, however, they are simply slightly above average stated troops that are no longer worth the drawback of Sentinel anymore, which has led to the large portion of Custodes decks essentially only running a handful of them. In fact, they are only running those for which Sentinel doesn't even matter in the first place. In my opinion, this could be fixed by fundamentally changing the Sentinel mechanic to no longer be a drawback, but a new and diverse playstyle that is different from the other factions in the game, as well as buffing a weak Warlord like the Baron Kalimakon and nerfing the Sentinel of meaningful Custodes changes Araskid Nassau. Do you have any other ideas about a potential Custodes change, or predictions on what the new Custodes from the Prospero rotation will bring us? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to also comment down your favorite Custodes experience from the game, preferably not how you were facing Nassau and he kept getting precognition from your troops until he eventually OGK'd you from near full HP while you could do nothing about it. Thanks. Thank you all so much for watching this video and this series. It is incredibly fun to make and has allowed me to experiment with a lot of things regarding editing and recording. Without all of your support, I wouldn't be making content the way I do now. I hope to see you all again in the next video. Until next time!